Hi everyone, I'm Michaela. I'm a farm to institution specialist with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and today I'm here at Bronx Park Community Garden in St. Louis Park, and I'll be going over some different techniques that you can use in your garden to control weeds. Dealing with weeds is one of the most universal gardening experiences, whether you have a small raised bed vegetable garden or a large pollinator planting or even a container garden, you'll almost definitely encounter weeds and have to make a plan for how you control them. It may sound simple, but a great first step to weed control is making sure you know how to identify weeds. There are some plants that in some contexts will be weeds and in other contexts they won't be. So there's just a lot of nuance in terms of what makes a weed versus what isn't a weed. If you have students or volunteers helping you in the garden, you'll also want to make sure that they're set up with the knowledge that they need to successfully identify weeds so that they can help you with your weed management plan. Generally speaking, if a plant is disrupting the growth or aesthetic of other plants in your garden, it's considered a weed. I once had a community garden coordinator tell me that the difference between a wildflower and a weed is if you find them pretty or not, which I think really exemplifies this nuance. Identifying which plants in your garden are weeds versus things that you planted intentionally can be difficult, especially early on in the growing season, but there are some strategies and context clues that you can use to figure out what you're looking at. For example, if you mark off areas where you've planted seeds, that can be really helpful to know not to pull anything in those areas. If you see seedlings popping up that are in neat, organized rows, that can be a good indicator that that's something that you planted intentionally and that those are not weeds. Looking up pictures of what your seedlings look like when they're small can also be helpful so that you know sort of what you're looking for. And on the flip side of that, looking up pictures or researching common weeds in your area can also be helpful so that you know how to identify those. For example, in this garden, I've seen some garlic mustard and some purslane, which are both really common weed species for this area. As you continue to spend time in the garden, it'll be easier to identify weeds as you become more familiar with them. And also, as your garden matures and your plants become more established, it'll get a lot easier to tell them apart from weeds in your garden. The most common way to control weeds is called mechanical control, which is pulling things up by hand or by using hand tools like a hoe or a rake. When you pull weeds out of the ground, you'll want to make sure that you're getting them up by the roots, otherwise they'll grow back. When I first started gardening, honestly, I really sucked at getting plants up by the roots, but as you continue to practice pulling weeds, you really get a feel for how to finesse them out of the soil. You can also use a hand tool like a hoe to sort of chop up weeds in your garden and dig them up by their roots. If you're using this method, you'll just want to be careful that you aren't damaging the things that are intentionally in your garden. So it's usually recommended to hand weed closer to your actual plants and then use hand tools for sort of larger areas of your garden. Mechanical weed control is very effective and very cheap, but it is also oftentimes one of the most time and labor-intensive tasks that you'll have to do in the garden throughout the growing season. To help make weeding less of a daunting task, you'll want to make sure that pulling weeds is built into every interaction you have with the garden. If you have classes that come out to the garden, you can spend the first 5 minutes together pulling weeds. And pulling weeds can also double as a great educational experience to learn about plant structures and help with plant ID. If you have volunteers helping in the garden, make sure that pulling weeds for at least a few minutes is part of their checklist. And also, to take things easier on yourself, make sure that hand pulling weeds is not your only form of weed control and that you have several tools at your disposal in your weed management plan. Another really effective and much less labor-intensive method that you can use in your garden is mulching. Mulch blocks weed seeds from receiving sunlight, so then they aren't able to sprout and mature. And there are a lot of different materials that you can use to mulch your garden. Some examples are wood chips or newspaper, landscaping fabric, plastic film, or straw. And when the growing season really takes off and your weeds might feel out of control, it's honestly a great strategy to just lay down a thick layer of mulch and hope for the best. So this gardener did a couple layers of newspaper. You can sort of see the newspaper down here with a thick layer of wood chips on top. And it's been super effective at preventing weeds on these parts of the garden. It's best to mulch earlier in the season if you're able to, and also you want to make sure that you aren't covering up any freshly planted seeds with mulch. So in this garden, this gardener actually used a partition to sort of separate spots of the garden that are mulched versus parts that don't have mulch so that the plants that are intentionally in your garden can still thrive. They're thriving. Similar to how mulch can be used to suppress weeds by blocking sunlight, planting cover crops in your garden can also be a great technique to control weeds. Cover crops have added benefits such as reducing soil erosion, fixing nitrogen, and adding more organic material to your soil. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to touch on the basics of cover cropping, but if you'd really like to dive into this topic, I recommend the U of M extension pages on cover cropping. Some options for cover crops that can suppress weeds include sorghum, barley, oats, radishes, red clover, and buckwheat. If you want to use cover crops to suppress weeds, it's generally recommended to seed them in the late spring to late summer, but the exact timing of when you plant your cover crops will greatly depend on the plant species that you select. So to plant cover crops in your garden, you can simply remove any existing weeds, scatter your seeds, and then rake them in. Make sure you're covering them with the recommended amount of soil depending on the crop type that you're using, and then just water them in. And using cover crops can be a fun thing to experiment with in the garden and can also be a cool way to expose students to real-world sustainable ag practices. Sometimes you just don't have the time or the energy to pull weeds by hand, and that's totally okay. Using hand tools or power tools to cut or trim your weeds back can be a great way to clear large areas of weeds at a time. Because you're not actually removing the roots from the soil, these weeds will pop back up, but it can buy you some time until you have time to weed again and will minimize the amount that they're competing with your other garden plants. Using herbicides or chemical controls in the garden can be tempting, but it's generally not recommended, especially in a school garden setting, as it can expose you and young students to chemicals that may be harmful to them. The last weed control technique I want to touch on today is just letting go of having total control over weeds in your garden. If your expectation is to have a completely weed-free garden, you're going to end up spending a lot of time and a lot of energy on weed control that actually may not be necessary. And accepting that the garden can still be a great place to grow food and foster learning, despite having weeds, will set you up for a much more rewarding and manageable gardening experience. As we've discussed today, there are lots of different techniques that you can use to control weeds in your garden. You can pull weeds by hand, use mulch, plant cover crops, or trim weeds back. The best weed management plans usually incorporate several different techniques, so feel free to try things out and experiment and figure out what works best for your garden space and your time limitations. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that today's video was educational and helpful for you to make a weed control management plan for your garden.